We are we are considering biblical appeals, and we have over the last 4 weeks or so dealt with making an appeal to someone in government, such as a police officer, someone at DMV, that kind of thing. Making an appeal to an employer, taking into account whether it's a boss that works for a big company or a boss that works for a small company. Some bosses are really handcuffed by the companies they work for, and the HR requirements leave them little wiggle room. If you're making an appeal to a boss who owns his own shop, then he can do anything he wants. And then I talked about several weeks ago making an appeal to your pastor, or making an appeal to one of your parents. And I have no recollection of ever making an appeal to either my mom or my dad. I have recollections of my mother for the last 30 years of her life bragging about going behind her father's back to get her way whenever she wanted something. Because she knew that her father would always say no, so she would always go to her mother instead of her father, and her mother would always give her what she asked for, despite what she knew her husband would want her to do. That's probably the only detectable flaw I ever noticed in my grandparents' marriage. So those are the appeals that we have dealt with, and how to take these utensils of making a biblical appeal and implementing them. I'm wondering if you have any questions on any of those situations that you might find yourself in that you would like to ask a specific question about before we we look at the issue of the evening, which is making an appeal to your husband. Obviously, I'm talking to half of you here, actually, I'm talking to all of you, because half of you should make an appeal. The other half of you should be willing to hear an appeal. And if you are a guy who has married a woman or who anticipates getting married someday, it will be your responsibility to train your wife. Spiritual leaders are trainers. They are leaders. And if you marry someone that does not know how to make an appeal, you might want to think about that. If you're already married to someone that doesn't know how to make an appeal, then you need to begin teaching and training her so that she will know how to help you. Because you're a guy, which means that you're prone to making errors in judgment. And so your wife has been given to you by God to be a help to you. And if you are not specifically attuned to being receptive to appeals made by her to help you arrive at a better, more wise, more spiritual decision than the stupid one you just made, make use of your wife and train her how to make an appeal. And if you are a woman, then you need to learn how to make an appeal to your husband. We remember from reading God's Word, we remember Abigail. She presented such a well thought out and skillful appeal to the young warrior David. And it was brilliant. Oh my goodness, the woman exhibited such wisdom and such clarity. But we read of no such appeal being made to her husband. She makes an appeal, a brilliant appeal to a stranger that she's only heard about, but not to her husband, who she is married to and lives with. Okay? And we see in the book of Ruth the wise counsel that Naomi gave to her daughter-in-law Ruth in her dealings with Boaz. Naomi gave to Ruth advice and counsel for how to negotiate in the culture of the Jewish people in Bethlehem, and how to deal with this kinsman redeemer in such a way that it would benefit her. And the advice that aged Naomi gives to Ruth is masterful, but we read nothing of any appeals Naomi might have made to her husband Elimelech before he died. Kind of interesting. We read of Sarah pleading with her husband Abram, urging him to go in unto Hagar. In Genesis chapter 16, I read verses 1 through 4. Please read along with me. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, that it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. She said, I want you to go have sex with my servant girl. And Abram said, okay. And Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Yeah, I can have kids and you can't. You know, he'll love me more than he loves you because I've given him a baby. Okay. So you say, well, why didn't you use this illustration of Sarai dealing with Abram as an example of making an appeal? Well, because there's an obvious difference between nagging and appealing. There's an obvious difference between haranguing your husband to do what you want. Now, it's this obvious difference is not apparent to a lot of women. They don't see the difference between nagging and appealing, the difference between haranguing, bending the ear of a husband, and presenting an appeal that encourages him to make a new decision based upon new considerations. I just really don't think that a girl has any business getting married before she understands the difference. Because married life is going to be hell for her if she doesn't understand the difference. It's going to be hell for her. You say, well, what if she marries a wimp? Oh, then it'll be worse, because she'll despise him. She'll have no respect for him. She will come to hate him. A man that can be pushed around by his wife is a man who eventually is despised by his wife. Okay? So we should ask ourselves, why is it that some women make terrific people, or make terrific people? Let me back up. Why is it that some women make terrific appeals to people other than their husbands? Wow! Did Abigail make a great appeal to the guy she wasn't married to? Wow! Did Ruth make a great appeal to the guy she wasn't married to? Some people, some women, can appeal to their bosses. They can appeal to judges in traffic court. Or to police officers. They know how to do that, okay? Or building inspectors, or sometimes even their own dads. But when it comes to their husbands, they find themselves absolutely unable to get her done. They can't do it. They just can't do it. You say, well, surely that's rare, Pastor. No, it is not rare. I believe that it's probably more common than not that women can that some women are better at making appeals to just about anybody other than the guy they're married to. You say, well, why is that? Well, let me turn it around. Let me ask you, ladies, why is that? You tell me about this woman that you know. She can make a better appeal to a cop or a judge or somebody at DMV or her boss or somebody down at City Hall or her pastor, but she cannot get it done when it comes to her own husband. Why? Maybe you've had coffee with this woman and she has poured her heart out to you. I can make appeal to this person, this person, this person, but not the guy I'm married to. Yes, ma'am. She said, because he won't listen to her. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
There's not the same emotional tie with a husband versus someone else.
Okay. You mean there's less emotion with your husband or there's more emotion with your husband? Okay, okay, okay. So, number one, he isn't going to listen to me. Number two, there's the emotional baggage in the relationship. Okay? These are good. These are good. Anybody, anything else? Patty. Okay. The husbands look down on their wives. Okay. Yes, April? Lack of respect. Those would be tied together. Yeah. 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 Okay, okay. This is good. This is good. This is good. Anybody else? Okay. Yes, ma'am?
I think what the other people use is the tools of a woman's strength on these other people where that would
She can use flattery and coyness and all that kind of stuff. The charms, that the charms don't work on him anymore. Okay. Maybe he looked down over his glasses and say, we've been there and done that, honey. You want to try something else? I don't know. Any others? Let me just mention a couple of things because I think these are valid observations. I would hasten to point out you probably are never going to find a status disparity in the 20th or the 21st century that comes close to the status disparity that existed 1,000 years before the time of Christ during the time of Boaz and Ruth. Okay? The disparity that existed between the man and the woman, between the warrior David and the wife of the man he is about to kill, Nabal, between the Bethlehemite Judean Boaz and the Moabite Ruth. Okay? I think your observations are valid. I just want to point out that those observations would have more than applied back then, and yet somehow that disparity was overcome. Well, if it was overcome, it still can be overcome. Okay? What else? What else? Okay? Okay? These yes, ma'am? I'm sorry? Intimidate. Absolutely. 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 Physical intimidation. A guy who is filled with anger and he glowers and he does this kind of thing. in front of or over his wife? Yeah, yeah. Maybe he's never put a hand on her, but he acts like he does. Okay? He acts like he's going to. Let me mention something else. It has been my observation over the course of my adult life that most of the women that I have observed interacting with men with whom they have an emotional disagreement exhibit really poor body language skills. Most guys don't have the kind of troublesome upbringing that I had. But literally, for the first 6 years of school, I got into a fight almost every day, and it was not a fight that I picked. Okay, it was somebody that was intent on bringing me down and attacking me because I was the only white kid in the school. And the American Indians, they wanted a punch fest on the white boy. And so there's a certain set of things that happen. Christian, come on up here. I think I can still beat you. And this is what happens whenever two guys are getting ready to go Duke City on each other. Okay? They square off at each other. As long as you have two guys that are walking down the street and they're talking diagonally across each other, even if they're mad, even if they're yelling, they're okay. Well, I just think that's pretty stupid. You go, yeah, well, I think you're pretty stupid. It's when they stop and turn toward each other that it's about to go physical. Okay? And yet every single incident that I have ever dealt with domestic violence, without the wife realizing it, what she ended up doing, and I'm not excusing it, is she got right up in front of her husband like this and started berating him. And then he punched her. Now don't get me wrong, there's no excuse for punching her. And she should dial 911 and have him arrested, and he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But I would think that when a little girl is growing up, one of the things that her daddy ought to teach her is, honey, don't you ever square off on a man. Don't ever do that. Don't ever do that. Because you don't want a guy to go, medulla on you. Okay? You don't want him to stop thinking and start reacting in a non-thinking way. Because let me tell you something, I had times when I was in grade school where a guy just got in front of me and I just did that to him without even thinking. Because I had had so many people walk up to me and throw a punch out of nowhere. I never started a fight. I never started a fight. But guys would walk up to me and do that and boom. Okay, thank you. And so sometimes wives need to pay attention to that kind of stuff. Now you say, well, what if a wife forgets and she squares off on her husband and punches her? Then he ought to be arrested and prosecuted and thrown in jail. He's wrong. But it's like walking up to somebody and spitting in his face and then getting all upset because he punches you. Okay, he shouldn't punch you. But you understand none of that would have happened if you hadn't spit in his face, right? You understand that, right? And I don't think that a man should ever put his hands on a woman or on his wife. But you understand, if you don't square off on him and then start verbally going after him, that can't happen. It can't happen until you do that body language thing on him, okay? You say, well, Pastor, I think Pastor really is on the guy's side. Actually, I'm not. I'm trying to avoid people doing thoughtless, irrational, hormonal things, okay? So, why do wives frequently find it easier to make appeals to people other than their husbands? And these are very good answers, okay? Let me add to that something, because it has to do with the appeal You cannot make an appeal to someone with whom you do not first have a what? A good standing with. A right standing. Okay? And if you think that the guy's an idiot, you don't have a right standing with him. If you are disrespectful toward him, you don't have a right standing. If he views himself as having a lofty position over you, you likely do not have right standing with him. Okay? Likely. All right? Esther was like this with her husband, and yet she successfully appealed. Abigail was like this with David, and yet she successfully appealed. Ruth was like this with Boaz, yet she successfully appealed. My point is, I don't think anything should stop you from trying. Okay? Especially this. What is a wife's alternative to a foolish decision made by her husband, other than making an appeal? Is it God's will for her to bulldoze him and try to bully him or berate him or harangue him into changing his mind, which might result in him going all emotional? I submit to you that I don't think a Christian woman, especially with a husband who is not obedient to God, has no alternative than a biblical appeal. I don't think there's an alternative. Now, I may be wrong. I just don't think there is. Okay? So if you're a wife, I believe it is in your best interest to posture yourself in such a way that you have maximum influence on the guy who has just made the dumb decision. I want you to be able to influence the guy who is at that moment a fool. He's made a foolish choice, a foolish decision. It was dumb. It was stupid. You can't say it's dumb. You can't say it's stupid, even if it is, because that'll ruin any chance you have of making an appeal to him. Okay? I just don't think you have an alternative. I don't think that, and I'll show you in just a moment, scriptural grounds. Well, that's just it. I'm just telling them to get lost. I'm out of here. I don't think that's an option for a Christian woman. Okay? Some people in our church may remember, I think some of you may remember, a guy growing up in a household in which the father dealt with a very, very, very rebellious son. And this son was rebellious like from the age of 6. Incorrigible from the age of 6 or 7. And the father dealt with him in so many different ways in an attempt to bring this youngster under control. And then finally he had to make some decisions that were very unpleasant. But frankly, I had no idea what the alternatives were. And he made some very tough decisions as a dad. And while he was at work each day, his wife fed the rebellious son and did his laundry and basically stabbed her husband in the back because she disagreed with her husband's decision. Rather than standing with her husband, the lad's father, rather than appealing to her husband, which she did not do and would not do, she instead betrayed her husband and undercut his authority in the home. It didn't end well. It, to this day, isn't ending well. This has been going on for 30 years. just to show you that there's a practical side to all this. I was on the phone for 2 hours yesterday with a pastor in Nebraska who called me. I've never met the guy. He sought my counsel after reading one of my sermons online. And it was a sermon about marriage and family, and he started doing Google searches until he found the church phone number, and I happened to think that the call was an intercom call, and I just, yeah, what can I, and it was an outside call, and I apologized, and we started talking. It seems that 2 of his 4 children married spouses who undermined their authority in the home, not the parents, but the children married really bad losers. The person that his 2 oldest are married to, the individuals that his 2 oldest are married to, undermine their spouse in the marriage terribly, and each one's a son married to a woman and a daughter married to a man. Each one of them is married to someone who manipulates mercilessly, viciously, vindictively, in a conniving fashion. And so he called me up because the sermon that he read reflected his philosophy. So he's wondering, my wife and I are wondering, what did we do wrong? Sometimes you don't do anything wrong. Sometimes kids are just stupid, okay? And I'm not, I told him, I said, I'm not sure that you can help them at this point, okay? But their marriages would be so much better off if the husbands sought first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. You hate to see somebody going through torment, heartache, pain, tragedy, regrettable things, and for some reason the husband just will not seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness. And the wife, same thing. If the husband sought first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and the wife was a godly woman who demonstrated wisdom as she properly appealed to her husband, wow, can God really do some things? But tragically, sometimes one will head off in that direction, the other one will head off in that direction, making obscene gestures at each other as they go, or they live the lives of quiet solitude where they're married, and then necessary conversations that ought to take place never occur, and so they live out a year and 2 years and 5 years and 10 years of quiet desperation, married to a person with whom they have no spiritual communion of any kind. And it's heartbreaking, and too proud to seek a resolution and a solution. So I don't want that to happen to anybody that I know. And so I would like to make 2 recommendations for women concerning appeals that they ought to make to their husbands. And sadly, many wives simply do not make appeals to their husbands. And so I'd like to make 2 suggestions in addition to the fact that these 7 requirements, these 7 necessities related to an appeal, they have to be in place. They have to be in place. You have to be in a right relationship with that person that you're going to make an appeal to, as much as is humanly possible. So let me just make two recommendations, and then you can spit on my shadow as I walk by if you want to. Okay, turn in your Bible to 1 Peter chapter 3. Here's recommendation number 1 as you're turning. Just forget about making an appeal. Just forget about seeking to influence your husband if you yourself are not a godly woman. you can be an ungodly person and you're mad at him for not being godly all you want, but unless you're a godly woman, nothing's going to happen. Why would God bless your carnality with results? Why would he encourage you to continue as you are by giving you what you want while you are not seeking him first? God is a wise parent who rewards commendable and upright behavior, and disobedience and carnal lethargy, not so much. Not so much. So forget about making an appeal or seeking to influence your husband if you are not yourself a godly woman. As Peter offers counsel to Christian women whose husbands are clearly disobedient to God, I want you to recognize that his advice is given only to women who are truly spiritual. I begin reading from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. Likewise, now you want to find out what that word is there for. You go back and look at the last half of chapter 2. Okay? You can't understand the next 6 verses unless you make a study of the last half of the previous chapter. But I don't have time for that. Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. Isn't it interesting that some women are subject to everybody but their own husbands? And they have respect and admiration for most of the men they know except the one that they're married to and sleep with. Likewise, you wives, be in subjection to your own husbands, that if any obey not the word, they also may without the word be won by the conversation or the conduct of the wives. This word conversation has to do with your lifestyle, not your speech patterns. Verse 2, while they, that is your ungodly, bad decision-making husband, behold your chaste conversation coupled with fear, whose adorning let it not be that outward adorning of plaiting the hair and of wearing of gold or of putting on of apparel, but let it be the hidden man of the heart, and that which is not corruptible, even the ornament of a meek and quiet spirit, which is in the sight of God of great price. For after this manner in the old time the holy women also who trusted in God adorned themselves, being in subjection unto their own husbands. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are, as long as ye do well, and are not afraid with any amazement. So, I could preach on this for like 6 months, actually. But in summary, forget appealing to him. Forget it. Forget trying to appeal to him if you're not subject to him. Just don't waste your time. And don't waste his time. See why? It'll just end in a fight. It'll just end in an argument. And you don't want to cause arguments. You don't want to cause a fight. And so if you are not in subjection to him, he will think that you're trying to get something out of him for nothing. And he'll resent it. He'll be offended by it. It will anger him. So rather than appealing to him, you'll just be making a fight. So don't do it. If you're not in subjection to him, then don't make an appeal. Forget appealing if your conduct is not holy and God-fearing. Verse 2. Oh, so it's on me now. Actually, yes it is. Yes it is. Forget appealing if your focus is on the externals. Verse 3. If your focus is on your appearance, that's not where the focus ought to be, either him or you. Forget appealing to your husband if your spirit is not meek and quiet. Verse 4. Do you have a meek and quiet spirit? Or is it abrupt and sharp? Is it venomous? Is it biting sarcasm? I remember one woman whose husband punched her. I asked her, I said, what happened? And she said, this was after 6 LA County Sheriff's deputies came at my request and took him into custody. I said, what happened? She said, I got up into his face and I said, oh, big man, big breadwinner. And he said, shut up, honey. I'm telling you, be quiet. And she then said, Pastor, then I started talking like, what are you going to do, tough guy? You going to slap me? You going to push me? You going to shove me? You going to order me around? Oh, big man, tough guy. Ooh, you're bad, you're bad. And she went on like that for 15 or 20 minutes, and then he hit her. You say, well, he should never have hit her. I agree. If she had been my daughter, I would have worked the guy over with a baseball bat. Okay? But what would not have happened had she not berated him for 20 minutes? Okay? I'm not saying he was right. He was wrong. Okay? I'm saying she wasn't right either. Okay? And she wasn't right first. She did not manifest a meek and quiet spirit. And so she had no business making an appeal. Forget appealing if you cannot trust God when your husband shows himself to be untrustworthy. Excuse me, ladies, guys are untrustworthy by definition. Cursed is the man that trusteth in man. I mean, if you trust a man, you're foolish. I believe that God warrants trusting a godly woman. His soul doth safely trust in her. But that is never said to a woman about any man, not even your husband. And therefore, instead of trusting your husband, you have to trust your God. And one of the things that disturbs women is they are disturbed by the fact that their husband is untrustworthy. Take it for what it is. Accept it as a fact. That's the way it is. Is your marriage something that was arranged by God? Then God arranged for you to be married to an untrustworthy man. Because no man is ultimately and in the final analysis trustworthy. And when he feels the pressure from his wife to be a trustworthy guy, I don't think that's pressure that he can bear. But he will be thrilled if his wife trusts God. Then the pressure's off him. Because she's trusting God, and God's not going to let her down. Okay? And forget appealing if you cannot display proper respect for your husband, even when his conduct is reprehensible, as Abraham's was. Verse 6. Notice what it says. Even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, she demonstrated great respect toward him. You say, well, he was the friend of God. He was the friend of God who put his wife in a position to possibly be raped, but for divine intervention on 2 separate occasions. On 2 separate occasions, had God not intervened, that gutless coward of a husband that she was married to was not protecting her from violent sexual assault. And God had to intervene twice. And yet, the Bible shows that her attitude toward this reprehensibly acting man was she called him Lord. In other words, she gave him respect that perhaps he didn't deserve. If you can't do that, you got no business making an appeal. And should I point out that according to verses 2 and 6, you should fear God and not be afraid of your husband? Some women don't appeal to their husbands because they're afraid of them. They're physically afraid of the guy, and maybe they have reason to be. Okay? They're physically afraid of him, or they're afraid of the consequences of what he might say or do if he doesn't like what they did. I'm sorry, but my Bible teaches that no Christian has any business fearing man. Christians should fear God. And I believe it does something to a bully and a coward when he discovers that you're not afraid of him, even if it's the guy you're married to. I don't think you should give a bully that. You say, well, this guy's a bully. I don't think you should reward a bully by being afraid of him. Okay? I'm not suggesting that you throw your chest out and stand up to him. I'm saying you should fear God, not him. He'll figure out that you're fearing God and not him. So based upon 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, if you're not the woman you ought to be, you got no business making an appeal. And notice This is a woman who's married to a bad man, a bad guy, who does not obey God, who is disreputable. Okay? And this passage is how to influence a spiritually non-functional husband. Okay? That's recommendation number one. You say, well, that you're a man. I'm just not going to pay attention. Okay. I mean, it's a free country. You do whatever you want. I'm just trying to help you. Recommendation number two. Turn in your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Recommendation number two. Please understand, I am wildly simplifying a very complex issue. Okay? This is very complex. And I'm taking it and distilling it down to its absolute essentials, right? I would not recommend that someone listen to me and then go out this evening and do something in response to what I said. What I would hope would happen is if what I said made sense to you, then you would come and talk to me about it, rather than launch out and do something that you might regret, right? Recommendation number two. Forget about appealing to your husband so long as he thinks your ultimate loyalty will be to him and not God. I want you to consider 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 through 16 very, very carefully, along with its implications. Notice what Paul wrote. And may I point out, before I read this passage, Paul, in the first half of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, deals with sexually experienced individuals, some of whom are Christians, some of whom are not, some of whom are married, some of whom are not. In the second half of 1 Corinthians chapter 7, he deals with sexually inexperienced men by talking directly to them. He deals with sexually inexperienced women by talking to their fathers. See, well, okay, what are you trying to say? When a woman is sexually experienced, she places herself without remedy in an entirely different category of God's dealings with individuals. She has done herself irreparable harm by rebelling against her father's protection and provision, watch care over her, by having sex with a man she's not married to. You say, well, I don't believe you. It doesn't matter. You'd be stupid in other areas also. But it's clear that she has moved from the end of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 to the beginning of 1 Corinthians chapter 7 in Paul's dealings. Okay? That can't be remedied. Okay? That cannot be undone. Okay. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning with verse 10. And unto the married I command, yet not I, but the Lord, let not the wife depart from her husband. General rule is Christian women don't leave their husbands. That's the general rule. Christian women do not leave their husbands. But, and if she depart, let her remain unmarried, or be reconciled to her husband, and let not the husband put away his wife. So a Christian husband shouldn't put away his wife. And if she leaves, you say, well, what might this be the result of? Maybe the threat of violence? Okay? But she should stay single. Verse 12, but to the rest I speak, not the Lord. If any brother hath a wife that believeth not, and she be pleased to dwell with him, let him not put her away. If you're a Christian man and you're married to an unsaved woman who wants to remain your wife, don't leave her and don't kick her out. Verse 13, and the woman which hath an husband that believeth not. If you're a Christian woman married to an unsaved guy, and if he be pleased to dwell with her, let her not leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Else were your children unclean, but now are they holy. But if the unbelieving depart, in other words, if an unsaved husband, he just says, I just hate being married to you, I'm leaving. Bye. Bye. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God hath called us to peace. In other words, don't get into an argument about it. Don't beg him to stay. Don't grab hold of his ankle and he's trying to get out the door and you won't let go of him. Don't do that. Don't do that. Let him go. Let him go. Just because he walks out doesn't mean it's over. Just because a divorce decree is finalized doesn't mean it's over. Okay? For what knowest thou, O wife, whether thou shalt save thy husband, or how knowest thou, O man, whether thou shalt save thy wife? So the Christian doesn't leave, and if the unsaved spouse decides to leave, let them go without a fight. Don't fuss with it. So with the understandable exceptions of a husband's adultery, or threat of violence, or refusal to provide for his family, the Christian woman should not leave her husband. However, Paul raises the possibility of the unsaved husband leaving, as we have read. Why would a lost husband leave if he is no longer pleased to remain? Why would he no longer be pleased to remain? So there are certain things that cause unsaved husbands to leave their Christian wives. And it should not be the misconduct of the wife. She's supposed to be a godly woman. She's supposed to be spiritual. She's supposed to be a spirit-filled Christian. So he's not going to be turned off by the nasty things that she's doing, because she's not doing nasty things. She's a godly woman. Okay? So it should not be the sins that a Christian wife commits that causes a man to leave, but her unapologetic godliness in conduct and ministry. He gets mad about her going to church. She goes to church anyway. He gets mad about her serving God. She serves God anyway. You don't ask an unsaved spouse for permission to go to church. You do not ask an unsaved spouse for permission to serve God. You don't do that. Okay. Some husbands leave because their wives insist on attending church and insist on serving in the ministry. Let them go. Let them go. How else are they going to be convinced that Christ is more important and should be thought more important than any man? Other husbands leave. Now listen carefully, because I've had bad experience with this. And I have been suckered by a guy. He left by moving the entire family away from his wife's church, and she fell for it. Some guys leave by trying to move their entire families away from their wife's church. Only the wife does not fall for the ploy of him dislocating her from her church family. He does that as a way of isolating her from the Christian community, and so she lets her husband leave without her. Reminds me of a woman 31 years ago under the preaching of the gospel. She lived over on Buena Vista in Duarte. And she and her two kids came to church, and she responded to the gospel and trusted Christ as her Savior. Wow, was this woman. Wow, it was amazing. And as I dealt with her afterwards and talked to her, and she was just thrilled and determined that she was going to live for Christ, she said, I got a problem. I said, what's your problem? She said, I'm living with a man I'm not married to. I said, that's a problem. She said, what should I do? I said, he's got to go. And she said, I know that. How long should I give him? I said, I'd give him at least an hour. He had everything he owned in the back of his dually pickup within 60 minutes of them getting back home. She kicked him to the curb so fast. It made a profound effect on her children and her family, and his head was spinning. And I thought, well, glory to God. And for the next 6 months, this woman was living for Christ and glorifying God and inviting people to church. She was doing the right thing. She was doing the right thing. Wow. This guy was a cement truck driver, one of these local places here. 6 months later, actually, it was his load that was the ramp for the, came from his truck. That's when I found out what really happened. Because he came back and har, what I did. Ha, 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 ha. This is what he did. He came to church. He just walked in one Sunday morning, 6 months after this gal got saved. And he sat and he listened and he got up and left. He came back that evening, then he got up and left. Then he came back the next Sunday morning, next Sunday evening. This went on for several months. Clever guy. He walks up to me after he made a profession of faith in Christ and said, Pastor, do you think there would be any problem with me inviting so-and-so out to dinner? Well, I feel sorry for people who have a really young pastor, because I was really stupid. I said, I don't think there'd be a problem. So he took her out to dinner, and then he took her out to dinner, and then he took her out to dinner, and then he asked her to marry him. And they came to me and said, we would like to be married. Would you perform the marriage? And I said, yeah, I will. I performed the marriage, and that was the last time she ever set foot inside a church. Why? Because when he married her, he put her in a house 4 hours out into the desert. She was so far removed from anything. And I just lost track of him. I didn't know what was going on until several years later when we're pouring the ramp. And lo and behold, the guy that backs into the parking lot of the cement truck is this guy. And he told me what he did. I got her. I got her. I got her away from you too. Har, 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 har. I got her. That's when I began to observe a pattern that I have seen repeated several times, where an unsaved guy figures out that the only way that he can deal with his Christian wife, I thought I killed that bug already. I have to kill it again. I didn't know the former president was in Los Angeles. Excuse me, I shouldn't have said that was out of line. I found on a number of occasions following that unsaved guys, and I'm specifically thinking about 2 or 3 women who came to our church and they got saved, and their husbands would never come, would never come, would never come. Their kids were coming. They were getting interested, and then the husbands moved them hundreds of miles away. And they did that to get their wives away from the gospel. And it worked. I'm thinking of 3 women right now that their husbands, they succeeded in what they were doing. You say, well, what should they have done? If a woman came to me and said, my husband says we're moving, what would you recommend? I would take her to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and I would suggest that she consider the likelihood that her husband is testing her loyalty to Christ, and that what you ought to consider saying to him is, bye, and we'll find out what he's really trying to do here. I gave that piece of advice to one woman, and she said to her husband, if you're leaving, you're going alone because I'm not leaving my church. Boy, did it make her husband mad. But she's still here. So I don't think that a husband who thinks Christ is not his wife's first concern is a husband his wife can appeal to. I think a husband has to have in the back of his mind an understanding that my wife's first concern is God and his glory. Her loyalty is to Christ. And that will be a factor in any unsaved man's considerations when it comes to making an appeal. And yet I know of many women, I'll admit that if you know, my advice is easier to give than to take. But if your husband thinks your loyalties are divided or confused in this regard, your attempts to appeal to him, I think, will be fruitless. He has to respect your convictions even if he doesn't like them, even if he doesn't agree with them. He has to respect them. My position as a man, I understand, is far less precarious than any woman's position is as a wife or as a mother of young children or an aged woman. That said, I find nowhere in God's word that a wife is supposed to deal with her husband from a position of fear. Yet I know of many women who I think they are terrified of making their husbands mad at them. And it cowers them and renders them impotent in influencing their husbands and their families. Or if they're not afraid of their husband getting mad at them, they're afraid of their husband possibly leaving them. And my attitude, I think, ladies, I think he needs you more than you need him. And unless you have destroyed your children instead of raising them, they will help you when the time comes that you need help. In short, I think I should always, as a pastor, encourage a woman to do right. And the younger you are, when you learn how to make an appeal to your husband, the better off you will be in the long run. And I think everybody else will be better off in the long run. If you're married to a guy for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and you've never, because of fear and concern of what he will do or how he'll react, you're scared of making an appeal to him, basically you're digging your own grave. You're going to make your old age untenable, and he may just walk on you anyway. If he doesn't walk on you, he'll walk out on you. So, anybody have a question? Yes, ma'am. Louder, please. Oh, absolutely. I think she would have been absolutely right on. Yeah. I think God intervened before she had to say anything. I don't think she was complicit. I don't think she was complicit. I think she was in the right completely. And I think God protected her from the despicable cowardice of her husband. I think the single most difficult thing for any believer to do or be is to be a Christian woman married to a guy. And I have no doubt about that, because you find yourself at the mercy of a human being. And not just a human being, a guy. Clods that we are, insensitive clods that we are, selfish, insensitive clods that we tend to be. Still, God has brought you into our lives for us to provide for and to protect. So, is it going to be challenging? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I understand the concept of us not trusting in man, but what do you call it when, for example, a wife expects her husband to honor his commitment and the marriage vows? What do you call that? If it's not trusting him to be faithful to his the marriage vows or and to protect her and the family, what do you call that if it's not trusting in him?
Well, I think it's based upon his past record. Has he given you reason to believe that he is dependable and reliable in that respect? Okay. Now, another thing keep in mind is in the Bible, every marriage in the Bible is a contractual obligation with the exchange of assets. And so when you had a guy in the Bible get married to a woman, there's an exchange of goods and services. And if he didn't come across, if he violated, it cost him a lot of money. So don't marry some poor guy who's got nothing. I'm a prenup guy. Prenup. So yeah, I think it ought, if you could work it out. Here's the worst thing that California did. California is the nastiest, most despicable state in the union. California decided to make divorce no fault. California became the first no-fault divorce state. Now think about that. The single most important contract that two adults can make with each other, which ought to be enforced, is the contract marriage. There is no contract more important than the marriage contract. And yet in California, they have made it so that there are no penalties for violating the most important contract known to man. None. And I think that it ought to be profoundly important. Okay? First of all, I don't think government should have anything to do with marriage. But I think that when people get married, if they've got assets, there ought to be really well-written legal documents known as prenups, a prenuptial agreement, where there are severe penalties for someone not keeping his word, not being faithful, not being reliable, and maybe these things are relaxed over time so that by the time you've been married for 10 years, then there is no penalty for certain things. But I think there ought to always be immorality clauses, always. But that's just me. Did that address your question so far? Anybody else have a question? Now I understand we don't live in the millennium. I know that. I am a fellow that I want Christian women to have as much influence in the lives of their men as is humanly possible. And one of the reasons I am teaching these principles of biblical appeals is I want to give you influence that you do not have, because I want you to be more influential. Are you going to have to bite the bullet and treat a guy a certain way in order to have that influence? Yeah, I think you will. Are you going to have to keep to yourself an opinion or two about some of the stupid things he says and does? Yeah. But maybe we should be more concerned about properly vetting people to find out what kind of decisions are they going to make under pressure. So, and I'm of the opinion that a great date does not always make a great mate. Boy, just because the guy knows how to open up the door and knows how to do all that, I think, where did he learn all that? How many women did it take for him to learn how to do that? If I were a woman, I think I would be much more interested in marrying some clumsy oaf of a guy that could barely walk across the parking lot without stumbling and falling. But when he gave his word, he kept it. And when he made commitments, he fulfilled them. And he honors his father and his mother. That's the guy to marry, in my opinion. But who am I? Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
So there's no confliction between the command of seek ye first the kingdom of God.
I'm sorry?
So there's no confliction between the command of seek ye first the kingdom of God and for a wife not to depart from her husband.
No, not necessarily.
In the fact that if he were to leave, that she's commanded not to leave him, but say there'd be a possibility where God could use her in another area if he needs her so bad, and he doesn't know that spiritually because God, can use her to work to him. But where do you draw that line that
You're confusing me now. Let me give you an illustration, and maybe this is where you're going. Let's say two people, a Christian woman is married to an unsaved guy, and he decides, I can't stand this. I hate being married to you. You won't let me spend my paycheck on partying, so I'm leaving. Okay? But he hasn't cheated on her. What should she do? Nothing. Let him go. Don't beg him to stay. And hang tough and pray like crazy until he makes it so that he is unqualified to come back to her as her husband. That would be he takes up with another woman.
what if he doesn't want to leave her?
Then she shouldn't leave him.
That's what I'm saying. So what if he wants to move, say 4 hours away?
Well, that's something she needs to consider. She can't read his motives, but see, I'm of the opinion that both husbands and wives are equal members in a church. I don't think a wife is an auxiliary church member. I don't think she has a less significant membership in the church that God has joined her to. Okay? And I think she should exercise extreme caution. Can she assume that what her unsaved husband is doing is God's will for her life? Based on what? Okay? And so, I'm not going to make her call for her, but wow, I would be, all I know is the women that I have seen their husbands pull them away from church have never gotten back into a church anywhere that they've been. And the result, their kids are now raised, their kids are not serving God, they don't go to church anywhere, and it's a mess. So, I think a woman needs to factor those things. Okay? Maybe she needs to have a hard talk with her husband. Don't think you're going to get me out of this church by taking a job someplace else. That's not going to happen. And then maybe he'll do that just because she told him not to. I don't know. This is really complex. Really complex. But this would be a situation where two people got married and then she got saved. Boy, a Christian woman that marries an unsaved guy, she is asking for a boatload of trouble. She is asking for a boatload of trouble. And so I just cannot imagine it going well. When a Christian woman marries an unsaved guy, I cannot imagine it going well. Or a Christian guy marrying an unsaved woman. I just can't imagine it going well. So, anybody else? Admittedly, this is a very, very complex issue, and maybe the only thing I've succeeded in doing this evening is raising questions that need to be addressed in private. Be glad to do that. But I want Christian wives and mothers to have profound influence in the lives of their husbands. And I'm convinced that if a wife has the right relationship with her husband, all of the things being equal, he wants to do for her. He enjoys doing for her. He loves doing for her. I mean, I love fulfilling my wife's desires. I love fulfilling my daughter's desires. I'm not a very imaginative guy, okay? I don't think of stuff to do, okay? I'll just, sit home and eat popcorn. But if one of them asks me something, let's do that. As much as I possibly can, I do. And I think that most husbands, I think we live in this era of feminism where most Christian women do not know how to cultivate the goodwill of their husbands. I believe that a wife needs to be loved by her husband. I believe a husband needs to be admired by his wife. Admired. Admired. Not loved. Admired. That's what Sarah was doing when she called him Lord. That was respect. That was admiration. That was acknowledgement of position. And that's what, in the day that we live in, so many women find that distasteful to their, and I don't think it helps them. I don't think it helps them. So, because guys have a tendency, men are very easily flattered by women. And I'm not suggesting that a guy's wife flatter him, okay? Flattery is a perversion of the treatment that he ought to get from his wife and his daughter and his mother, that kind of thing. Admiration. Flattery would be a manipulative form of the same thing, okay, which is no good. So, all right, pass your attendance slips to the nearest aisle if you would, please. I have gone a long time, and